welcome. I'm here to talk about multi-tenancy and the internals of multi-tenancy. We just had Simon on. I'll try not to use the C word too often. But I don't know, on our website, we have got a little thing that says enabling the multi-tenant software as a service in the cloud for Alfresco. So my name's Vonka. Just a quick intro. I'm a senior developer at Alfresco. I've been there for over 5 years. Primarily work in the core repository team, covering all the foundation services, and more recently, over the last year, helping to deliver the first iteration of the cloud services, and most recently, developing and delivering the hybrid cloud sync service. At one time, I used to work and live and work here in the Bay Area, so it's actually great to be back. And I'm just saying my passion is flying hot air balloons, and it's an outdoor kind of sport, but there was one time when I flew a hot air balloon indoors, which was in the hangar, which is just up the road at Moffett Field. So I thought I'd just put that picture in there, and that was a good experience. Hot air balloons are pretty big, so that's a big hangar. So just in terms of an agenda, just like to give a quick overview of what we mean by multi-tenancy, and then talk about the core of multi-tenancy, which is in the Alfresco Enterprise Edition, but it's also in the Community Edition. And then a little bit about how we've extended that for Alfresco in the cloud, and how does it differ. And in many ways, it doesn't differ, but I'll just explain a little bit about what the differences are. And hopefully we'll have time for a quick summary, any feedback that you might have. Because it's kind of a topic which doesn't really lend itself to pictures, I thought I'd throw in a few pictures. I haven't got as many as Simon had, and he had some pretty good pictures there. So what I've done, I've just put a few photos of rocks being balanced. This is off on the Jurassic coast in the south of England. There's a guy who does this. I've put some photo credits at the end, just to mingle the slides with a few photos as well. So one of the things I wanted to ask was, I don't know how many people may have tried the multi-tenancy option in Alfresco. I don't know if there's a show of hands. Has anybody tried it? Okay, that's good. It's something at the end, if you wish to try it out, it's quite easy to have a try, and I've put some references at the end of the talk. Another question is, how many people have a cloud account with Alfresco? Hopefully. And anybody who hasn't put their hand up, hopefully you get a chance to sign up today. And if you do have a cloud account, then you are using multi-tenancy anyway. So and hopefully that'll become clear as I go through. So in terms of those people who know Alfresco, hopefully, I just want to talk a little bit about how people deploy Alfresco. Now, you can obviously install it on your laptop, on a single machine. I've taken an extra example that if you say installing Alfresco 4, you might start spreading, you might install it, so for example, you keep the database on a separate node, on a separate machine. Those machines can be physical or virtual. So you might split your Alfresco shared repository from your database. That's 2 machines. Or you might, in this example, the green boxes kind of imply machine nodes. You might put share on a separate web tier. And with Alfresco 4, you might split out the search index as a separate Solr server, which connects to Alfresco. So then we now have 4 nodes. The metadata goes in the database. The binary content is on a shared file system. And the search index are kept separate as part of Solr. And then you may even have some kind of web proxy to allow protocols and APIs in separately. So there might even be a web proxy node, and through there you access Alfresco through things like CMIS, the REST-based web scripts, or WebDAV, etc. Another example here is the same kind of picture, but you're now scaling out. So, for example, we may have multiple share nodes. For high availability, you may have a repository cluster of at least 2 nodes, maybe more than 2. I've shown that transformation services are now split out, so we have 2 or 3 nodes for transformation. The database is multi-node, and the search services are now also split out across multiple nodes. So now we've got on the order of 10 or 15 machine nodes to manage. And what I haven't shown on the diagram is there's load balancers on the clusters, and there may be additional web proxies as well. And another way of showing this, I borrowed this slide from somebody else. This is more of a physical diagram. I don't know if the slides that are downloadable, I did adjust them slightly, so hopefully they'll get updated if they're not already on the DevCon website. So here's just an example, very similar to the previous one with the web tier. The content tier on the left is the repository cluster. The index tier on the right is the Solr cluster. And there's a little note there which you can read later, which talks about where the Solr nodes actually have an embedded repository and they access the database directly. There's a little, this diagram is missing the dots to the database, which is, I think, the second box up. But you can have a look at that afterwards. So it's just another example of that deployment I showed earlier. So what I've tried to do is condense those diagrams into a very simple logical diagram. We've got an Alfresco cluster. This is a vanilla install of Alfresco, which I would call a single instance of Alfresco. And effectively, for your organization, it's a single tenant. You install it as an enterprise. That's your organization. You're running it effectively in single tenant mode. And the yellow there is meant to represent your data, the metadata in the database I mentioned earlier, the binary contents, and the search index. So if you're an organization that's a large organization, you have many, maybe separate subsidiaries, maybe you're a government organization with municipalities or departments that are separate, and you wish to expand your usage of Alfresco, maybe now you have you want to run 4 instances of Alfresco, and bear in mind those diagrams before, you're now managing a large infrastructure, you have effectively 4 separate tenants, and you have multiple instances of Alfresco. I've just color-coded them yellow, black, blue, white, and you can see that splits out like that. So in a nutshell, the multi-tenancy option allows you to bring that all back together and run a single instance of Alfresco, which is effectively partitioned or sharded for multiple tenants. And logically, I've shown it with the colors there that your data is separate. But in fact, the default option is the data is commingled, both in the database on the file system and in the search index. We can talk about that a little bit more later. So I'm in development, so I'm not really a person to ask why necessarily you'd want to use multi-tenancy in terms of saying whether you should or should not use multi-tenancy. But here's some reasons why you might consider to do so. Economies of scale in terms of licensing costs, we license per CPU, and sort of measuring your sort of overall total cost of ownership. And as you saw from those previous diagrams, arguably it would be easier to manage as a single instance hosting multiple tenants. It might be 4 tenants or 10 tenants or more. We've talked about to organizations that maybe want to run 20 tenants or however many. And one of the key reasons for us is I was one of the people that built the multi-tenancy option quite a while ago. But for us, as we've moved into the cloud, it becomes essential in terms of scaling. And I'll touch on that a little bit further on as well. And also, in terms of, for example, the cloud usage of multi-tenancy, that it actually allows for potentially new use cases. And the example would be, for example, business-to-business collaboration. And if you use the Alfresco cloud, you see that you can actually invite other people from other networks. And I'll hopefully mention that later on. Effectively, an Alfresco network maps directly one-to-one to an Alfresco tenant. So as I mentioned, we've provided the option since Alfresco version 3. And quick summary here, basically you can run a single instance of Alfresco that can host or allow multiple tenants to view the Alfresco instance as if it's their own. So you as a user it just feels like it's your own version of Alfresco. Each tenant can access that repository or that instance as their own. It's fully partitioned, so tenants are isolated from each other, and I'll come back to that point a little bit later on. And it's agnostic to the user interface and the APIs and protocols. I've thrown in at the end one of the things we did early on, because Alfresco as a platform, people often customize Alfresco. One of the things we did do at the time when we introduced the multi-tenancy option, one of the kind of prerequisites for, at least for Alfresco Enterprise and Community at that time, was the ability to allow tenants to customize up to a point their models. So what we had introduced was the ability to have dynamic models. Previous to that, you had to restart the server to apply a model. And it's something that can actually be used separately from multi-tenancy, but it was something that was effectively a prerequisite for us to show that Alfresco could be used as a full system in a multi-tenant mode. So I just added that point. But you don't have to use the multi-tenant option in order to use dynamic models. If you're interested in that, there's more information on the wiki and the documentation, or you can come and find me later on. So in terms of the core of multi-tenancy, I don't know how many people know Alfresco or some of the internals of Alfresco, but the way the repository is structured is effectively broken down into stores. And those, if you use some of the foundation services, you get exposed to those. We provide some stores out of the box, and I'll explain that in a second. But those stores point, a store effectively is named, and it points to a root node. And then those nodes have a hierarchy, and then there's associations between those nodes as well. So I'm only just going to skim over this, but if you're interested, come and see me later. But that node hierarchy, by default, is there's a parent-child relationship between those nodes. And you can think of that, that's what the example I'm giving below, is when you access Alfresco through Share or through Explore or through WebDAV or CMIS, typically you see what we call effectively the live store. And it's also internally called the Workspace Spaces store, if you're familiar with that. And if you use something like Explorer, you'd come in through Company Home at the top, and then you could see the sites, and then you'd have your individual sites below that. Or if you're using Explorer, you'd see things like your user homes. So that's kind of a very quick, just to remind ourselves of the structure of Alfresco. And I mentioned that we have actually a number of inbuilt stores that are uniquely named. The one that most people work with on a data or notice is the Workspaces store, but also behind the scenes we keep all the versioned nodes in a separate store. So there's a version 2 store. There's an archive store, which for most people they can think of as the trash can. If you're using the trash can, there's an archive store. There's also an internal user store, which stores effectively the directory of users. We keep people profiles actually somewhere else in terms of the live store, and there's another system store. If you're interested in any of that, one way, obviously you could start looking at the database, which is a little hard to navigate, but a good way if you're interested in looking at that structure is you can go through, if people have used that before, is the node browser, and it's available both in Explorer and Share, and you can sort of drill down into those stores and just get a feel for how things are structured. So in terms of multi-tenancy, when we introduced it, one of the key things was we didn't want to pollute the code base and with some sort of, basically we need to know what context you're accessing Alfresco. And that tenant context had to be passed into Alfresco in some way. And there isn't a kind of standard way of doing that. So the way I chose to do this is effectively using your login. And what we could do is we could piggyback off the authentication context in Alfresco, which is managed by a component called ACG, which is now really part of Spring. It's Spring Security, basically got absorbed by Spring. And that context holds your security context when you've logged in. So in terms of multi-tenancy, we basically require you to have a fully qualified user ID. And the example I've given here is I chose to basically use an @ and effectively make it look like an email address. It doesn't have to be an email address if you're using multi-tenancy, but you may wish to use an email address. And so here, user ID @my tenant, or it might be fredblogs@acme.com. And that fully qualified user ID, in a nutshell, is how it drives multi-tenancy, because by logging in with that ID, we can effectively strip off the tenant and know what tenant you belong to. And that allows us to then provide the multi-tenancy option through any interface, for example, WebDAV, CMIS, REST APIs. As long as you can log in uniquely, we can work out which tenant you belong to. And then internally, I just mentioned about how we structure the repository. We can actually mimic, basically we can create separate stores for every tenant. And we can unmangle the tenant name so that by the time we've stored it, for example, in the database, you don't see that because it's below the level of the interface, it's below the APIs. We can change that. For example, the example of the live store is Workspace Spaces store. We can mangle the store identifier. And I just put some delimiters there with double @, but you can see the tenant ID in green maps across into those store names. So we've already partitioned the data per tenant in terms of those stores, and then all nodes below there are by definition within those stores. So the example I showed earlier where you navigate down your company home, or you're drilling down through WebDAV or through Share, through, for example, your folder structure, you could see that you go, from a user's perspective, when they've logged in, they just see company home, but it's a different company home for every tenant or for every organization. You can have the sites can have the same name. So in this case, the two tenants have sites. They've created the same name site. They haven't created site 1, site 2. But those names don't overlap because they're in a separate tenant. The only thing you can't have differently is the user IDs. The user IDs have to be unique across the system, so they are fully qualified. So for example, there's Fred Smith and John Doe at acme.com, or there's another one, Fred Smith, John Doe at another company.uk. Effectively, those two Fred Smiths are different people. They're different identities. And if you happen to know the password of those, then obviously you could get into either tenant. So what we do is when you use Alfresco, vanilla Alfresco, when you start the system up for the very first time, you effectively have an empty database. What we do on a normal startup of Alfresco is we would effectively bootstrap the schema object. We create all the schema objects, empty tables, foreign keys, etc. In a multi-tenant system, that still happens. We bootstrap that the very first time you start it up. But then what we do is when you provision your first tenant, or you create a tenant, or second tenant, or third tenant, we then import the default data. In fact, the default data is those stores that I mentioned, those 5 stores. We basically bootstrap or import another 5 stores in, which is fairly quick because it's 5 rows in the database. So now we have 5 more stores for every tenant, which is a pretty lightweight operation just to create the tenant. But there's extra default data that has to be imported in terms of, for example, if you're familiar with the internals of Alfresco, there's things like the data dictionary area, etc. So those are the 5 stores, and we add the tenant into effectively a tenant table inside the database, which is not actually linked to any other tables, but it stores some basic information about the tenant ID, the fully qualified domain name of the tenant, whether the tenant's enabled or disabled, and also things like the content root. I mentioned earlier the content is commingled on the file system, the binary content, but there is an option to shard it or effectively route it to separate directories or separate areas, so every tenant can be, the binary content can be separate. So there's an option when you provision the tenant to actually split out the content. I've touched on this already, but effectively, whenever you access Alfresco in the multi-tenant mode, you have to always access all the APIs, all the services through the tenant context, which is by definition through your login. Something I worked on recently as well was the public sharing for the cloud, and I just put in there because it's actually one of the notable exceptions where, in very few cases where we don't use your login, because we can actually uniquely identify the location in another way, which is basically by the short URL that the public link has in the cloud. And this is an option that's coming to, it's in Community 4.2, and it'll be in part of Enterprise as an option if people wish to use that. So those links can actually, we can work out which tenant you belong to, or basically there is no authentication, any user, because by definition it's a publicly shared link. So it's one notable exception where we don't use your login because there is no login, but in most cases you, by definition, have to have a login. And in fact, things like, if people have used Alfresco in the past, there's things like guest access. We didn't really support guest access in a multi-tenant mode. But actually, if you wish to use guest access, you can, but you'd have to fully qualify the guest names. You'd have to say guest at acme.com and then provide any password that would let you in. So it's not really probably a good use case, but for all intents and purposes, all access to the repository has to be through a login, through a tenant context, and apart from quick share here. And in terms of lower down, in terms of data access objects where we map onto things like the database, that's where effectively the tenant ID comes in, and I showed you earlier where we mangle these store names. And by the time we write to the database, it's the kind of fully qualified tenant ID. But it's something that most developers, most people using Alfresco would never see because they'll be going through high-level interfaces, either the foundation services like the node service and things, which I'll talk about in a minute, or protocols such as WebDAV or CMIS or REST-based web scripts. I did put one more point there for people who are interested. There are some cases where low-level jobs or patches might occasionally have to run across multiple tenants, and that can be, for example, to do a patch that we've had to do. It's pretty rare. And I did put all in question marks. If you're running a multi-tenant system with 4 tenants or 10 tenants or 20 tenants, it's probably reasonable to, if you have to patch something or run a job across all those tenants, as long as that job is a quick job, it's probably actually not an unreasonable thing to do. But in terms of the cloud, the scale is very different, and we can't run across 50,000 networks. So that's what the question mark refers to. It's not as simple as just saying I'm going to run it across all jobs. But if you're running a smaller system, or a sort of effectively like a private multi-tenant system that's accessing, for being used for, say, 20 organizations, then that's not an unreasonable thing to do if you need to. Code doesn't really work on these displays very well, but I thought for those people who are interested in code, I provided a few reference points here. Sometimes people ask, you may wonder why the code is done in a certain way. It was done, some of the core code has been there for quite a while, but one of the reasons it was done in that way was it wasn't clear right at the beginning. There was a time where we weren't sure whether it was going to be an enterprise-only option. So the time I was asked to build this was, we were still working out how it would go, but in the end it was decided to be a community option as well. So, but it was originally designed to be pluggable, so that we could effectively make it enterprise-only. So, but it's actually not the case. It's available in community and enterprise. So these hook points effectively is how they drive the multi-tenant option from below. The simple one is the multi-tenant service. It provides the basic name mangling that I mentioned earlier. Based on your login, it will mangle the IDs internally. There's an admin service, tenant admin service that controls, provides the interfaces for example, provisioning tenants, creating the tenants, disabling them, etc. And I threw in the example of the multi-tenant node service interceptor. There's various ways that we hook in multi-tenancy within the rest of the code base, but this was an interesting example of the, if you know Alfresco, there's a kind of a core component in terms of the DB, or the node service that acts across the database in terms of metadata. And rather than pollute that, or adapt that code to, inject, which is the way we typically do it, is inject an interface into that area. What we've done instead is intercept it, because the node service has sort of very highly typed arguments, so we can actually mangle in and out on the way out. So from a user's perspective, or from a developer's perspective, they just see the Alfresco interface in a standard as if it was a vanilla instance. But if you look at the code, it's not a lot of code to look at. You can look it up. It's available on Community Head or in Enterprise if you access the Enterprise source code. And here's just a quick thing you can look up again. It's a reference point and how it's injected in Springs. We've now got a lot of Spring context files. They're sometimes hard to find what you're looking for, so I've just put this in as a reference point. And there, right at the bottom of the screen there is the underlying database node service that implements the node service interface, and then it's wrapped by the interceptor, and then it's exposed. And there's some more config that I haven't managed to put on the slide where the actual public node service is then exposed higher out. So it's something, if you're interested, you can look up or come and ask me later. And basically, for multi-tenancy, we've had to enable all the services, all the foundation services, to be multi-tenant enabled. Other examples of the file folder service, those are used by basically things like WebDev, well, used by all interfaces, Share, WebDev, CMIS. They all go through the file folder service. I think in the terms of the mobile SDK, they've renamed that to document folder service because that fits with the naming convention of CMIS, which is based on documents and folders. But effectively, that follows a similar pattern. But in terms of the underlying foundation services, pretty much all those, or in terms of files and folders, they go through the file folder service. Underlying foundation service called the content service, etc. I'll mention this a little bit later on, but in terms of search and workflow, previously to 4.x, we also had to multi-tenant enable third-party components in terms of Lucene and JBPM. And now for Alfresco 4, we now support also Solr and Activiti. And I think I've already mentioned about the APIs and protocols. They're all multi-tenant enabled, or these examples at least. So what's new in Alfresco 4? As I just mentioned, the Activiti now supports multi-tenancy in addition to JBPM previously, and that's the default option. And now there's one can use the Solr option as well. And for Solr, we have to effectively, the way Solr hooks into Alfresco, we have to be able to track those tenants. And if you're interested, come find me, I can explain that a little bit more. But effectively, when you're querying the Solr servers, we have to be able to pass that tenant context across through the query, equally when we're indexing. So it works kind of both ways. A minor thing is we've also, in order to keep the code base as common as possible, there's, in the past, it was, in order to configure multi-tenancy, you had to rename, I think it was 3 sample Spring context files, which wasn't hard to do, but it was just another step. What we've decided to do is to, just to keep everything consistent with what we're doing in the cloud as well, is to pre-configure the multi-tenant option. It's actually disabled by default, so it's not used. It's just pre-configured in, and it's effectively a no-op. And it gets auto-enabled if you create your first tenant. So if you're an administrator, or if you're interested just from a developer's perspective, if you download Community, say 4.2, you can just go in. There's an old-style admin interface through Explorer where it's on the wiki page how to use it, but you can then just create your first tenant, and then it will be auto-enabled. But you don't need to rename any configuration files, so we added that in version 4. I mentioned earlier we had a tenant table. There's some internals. We used to hold the tenants in an attribute service. We actually migrated that into a sort of first-class table. And then in terms of some of the work we've done for version 4, including from customer feedback, is mostly driven around the cloud. There was some cases where it actually made sense to consolidate some of the ways we did things, especially in terms of in-memory caches. So there's now, internally the caches are now effectively tenant-enabled underneath. We used to have them driven sort of from a higher level, and it kind of made it a little harder to maintain. So there's some sort of internal improvements that we've done, but partly out of what we've done in terms of cloud and also in terms of customer feedback. And that's why I mentioned there at the bottom there in terms of just generally bug fixes and other improvements. So in terms of the cloud, how does it differ? And I think I mentioned earlier, in many ways it doesn't. It's the same core code that drives both multi-tenant option in enterprise and community, but also in terms of the cloud. But there are a few differences. It's obviously hosted on Amazon, Amazon Web Services. And here, the same diagram I showed earlier, if you remember it, I've just marked it in terms of we use RDS, MySQL version of RDS. The content is on S3. We have a S3 connector from Alfresco to S3, and we use Solr as a search index. And just as an aside, I think it's almost imminent, we're going to be releasing the enterprise version of the S3 connector, which you can use alongside. There's a caching store, which I'm not going to go into today, but I think there's another session straight after me, not in this room, I think it's in a different room, with one of our partners that talk more about that as well. So that's probably worth attending if you're interested. But they're using the community version, or there's an external community version that Lewis first did. We took that in board, changed it slightly for cloud, and we've now packaged it up as an enterprise option because a lot of customers want to run their own Alfresco instances, and you can use that outside of multi-tenancy. That's just if you wish to run Alfresco in the cloud for your own private instance. So that's the same diagram as before, just being run on Amazon. Here's a picture I borrowed from DevCon in Berlin. One of our DevOps team used this in their lightning talk. So I assume this is now in the public domain, but it's just a logical diagram of how we run the cloud on Amazon. It's similar to the diagram I showed earlier, but there's some web proxies in terms of Apache at the top. There's Alfresco nodes. Those Alfresco nodes both run share and repository together in this case. There are Solr nodes shown on the left down the bottom, and transformation nodes on the right, and database is marked as RDS and S3 content store. So it's just another way of visualizing the previous slide. So the big difference for the cloud, in terms of all the things I've just spoken about, is until now I've mentioned that all the tenants are fully partitioned and are completely isolated. But the difference in the cloud is we allow you to switch network. We allow you to be invited into multiple networks, effectively into multiple tenants. So there's some blurring in terms of accessing content. You can now access content in other tenants if you've been invited in. And that's really the big difference in terms of we have a cloud extension that's currently not open source. It's part of the cloud. And what we've done is, before I mentioned the authentication context, actually your login basically drove the fact that you belong to a tenant. That tenant ID identified which tenant you belong to. With the cloud, it's different because now you do belong to what we call a primary tenant, which is the same as before. The primary tenant is basically based on your email address. But now you can be invited into multiple secondary tenants. And the thing for us is that then we need to be able to pass that tenant context in some other way. And I mentioned the protocols like WebDAV don't provide that support, or CMIS, or even share. So what we've done is we've extended all these areas to allow us to switch the network. And that's done in a number of ways. One example for share and surf is we have effectively a URL segment, and if you're using the cloud, you'll notice it, which allows that part of the URL actually identifies what network you're in. So by default, you go into your primary network. In the future, we might even provide the option where you can provide a preference. So if you have a different network that's effectively your favorite, your default network, we may allow you to choose that as a preference, but that's an optimization. But at the moment, you go into your default network and you can switch your network in share. So share and surf have been extended to support that. In terms of things like WebDAV protocol, we provide another layer of folder hierarchy. So as you go in, the first level of hierarchy is no longer your sort of sites list. It's now your network list. And that's effectively, the networks will look like folders in the terms of WebDAV, so you can now drill down. So in order to use WebDAV, you have to have an enterprise network account. But then if you have that, then you can access any other network, even if it's a free network, if you've been invited to any other network using WebDAV. And that WebDAV, if you're using that, you'll see that it's got an extra level of hierarchy at the top, which is your network list. It's a bit like on the mobile client. You select which network. If you use the mobile client, it's the same idea. CMIS, I'm not sure if I've mentioned that. It's not on the list there, but CMIS, we effectively map onto separate repository IDs. So each network that you belong to is a separate repository ID. So with the public API that's been launched on the cloud first, that's how you would access it in terms of passing your tenant context. Oh yeah, I mentioned the public API at the bottom there. The other big difference, obviously, for the cloud that I touched on earlier is the scale. So we're now with hosted multi-tenancy as an option, which we've talked to a number of customers that are doing that, where they want to run 5 or 10. They're running a couple of instances or a handful of instances, and now they want to consolidate those using the multi-tenant option. That's fine, and they may run 5 tenants or 10 tenants or 20 subsidiaries on one instance. But I've said they may be running up to, say, 100 tenants, maybe 10 or 100. But the cloud is now supporting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tenants. And I think David Gilder mentioned in one of the talks earlier yesterday, I think, that we've got over 30,000 companies signed up. And so the key thing for us is that we can use the Alfresco cloud instance as a way to obviously push any improvements back into the core codes, in addition to any feedback we get from existing multi-tenant enterprise customers. A lot of the changes are driven by sort of cloud use cases. In terms of futures, there's obviously this is very speculative. If you're interested in more, probably come talk to myself or the product management team. But some of the things we will need to look at over time is obviously scaling will always be the #1 priority. And it doesn't just apply necessarily just to the cloud, but there are enterprise use cases where people may wish to partition their data. Now, we talked about, by default in multi-tenancy, the data is commingled. I showed you the option where you could actually split out or effectively route the content to different areas of the content store. But also, in some cases, people may wish to have the option to actually route the database to separate schemas in the database. One reason is effectively they wish to isolate that data in the database. It may be for backup reasons or other reasons where they wish to pull out the data and use the underlying database tools to do that. It might be that we want enterprise network customers to be effectively hosted in their own database instance. So there may be reasons why. And if you're running an enterprise multi-tenant instance with 10 or 100 tenants, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do if we decide to add that option. We've got some prototype code that pretty much does the job, but we haven't productized it. The thing is, we couldn't do that with tens of thousands of tenants. The schema objects take up too much space. It's not a problem with 10 or 100 tenants, but it would be an issue. You just can't create tens of thousands of schemas. It just takes up way too much space. It wouldn't scale in that way. But for a smaller number of tenants, that's a perfectly reasonable use case. And in terms of partitioning and sharding, the same would be true, for example, of the Solr search indexes. We'd need to shard those indexes. So that's areas that we'll be looking at. More specific areas are things like the SharePoint protocol. I think that's going to come out in the cloud first, so that'll be, by definition, multi-tenant enabled in the cloud for allowing switching of networks, and that may be something we push back, possibly support in the enterprise edition as well. There'll be areas where we'd have to refactor things like the dynamic models, particularly as we move towards CMIS 1.1, that provides secondary types, which effectively are aspects, and it provides type management around allowing incremental addition of types and properties. So that might be an area that we wish to also make sure that's multi-tenant enabled. This one I'm probably open to feedback from people, but in some ways people may wish to also, to some extent, customize share. That's always a tricky thing, how to do that in a service that can't easily be restarted in terms of multi-tenancy, but that's an area, if you've seen talks by David Draper and others, there are ways of changing the share interface dynamically, and that maybe is something we should consider having in the multi-tenant option as well, so that you could do that on a per-tenant basis outside of things like theming and other sort of inbuilt preference mechanisms for example, in the cloud it would be network admins, or in the enterprise it would be the admins can control. And there's just the ability to run, for example, multi-tenancy in a private cloud. People have shown interest in that as well, either with or without network switching. So there's areas that we can talk about, and obviously come and see me or some of the product managers if you're interested in other areas. So a quick summary, how are we doing for time? I think we're okay. So yeah, I think I've said this already a couple of times, but the core multi-tenant option in terms of what you'd find if you look at the community code base or the enterprise code is fully partitioned by your tenant context, which is driven by your login. In the cloud instance, I probably skimmed over it earlier, we actually separate out the tenant context and from the authentication context. But in terms of multi-tenant core, it's driven by that. And in terms of Alfresco 4, we've multi-tenant enabled things like Activiti, the workflow engine, and Solr. Various improvements and bug fixes have come in, and especially as we've worked more on the cloud services. The network switching is the big difference for the cloud. And if you haven't had a chance to try it and you're interested, then it's very easy to download, install it locally, and just create your first tenant or a few tenants, and you can see it in action. There's some information on the wiki, or come and talk to me later on. Thanks very much for your time. I don't know if anybody has any questions now, or we can do it offline later.
I have a question on performance.
Okay.
In a multi-tenancy mode, when Alfresco runs, how does it perform? How does it scale?
Well, performance is in a sense, it's no different to running any Alfresco instance. Performance and scaling is one of our top criteria, especially obviously working in the repository team, but at Alfresco in general. So it's like anything. It's how long a piece of string is. But the performance, I'm not aware of any specific performance issues with multi-tenancy, because it's a switching mechanism, and it's how you scale your system. So it all comes down to the standard things for any Alfresco instance is how you measure performance. So in terms of profiling it for your use case, so it requires testing. I mean, customers that run multiple instances of Alfresco and running at a larger scale will probably be effectively profiling and measuring that. And one of the things we're doing within Alfresco's internally, we're doing a lot more internal benchmarking across all use cases, but particularly driven around the APIs. I think Simon mentioned earlier in terms of Amazon Web Services, a lot of it's all about the API, and we've now launched a new public API for the cloud, which is also going to be put back into effectively Enterprise 4.2. And it's those interfaces, those low-level as well as higher-level interfaces that we're effectively always testing on a day-to-day basis for performance. So it really is a generic answer.
See, as the number of tenants go up and the number of users under each tenant will go up, do you dynamically scale the number of Java processes behind the scene, or how do you?
So I didn't quite hear what you said. As the number of tenants go up and the number of users per tenant go up.
So how do you handle the do you start additional Java processes?
The cloud, for example, allows us to scale out, yes. But you could do that anyway in an Alfresco instance. You can run more repository nodes. So it's no different to having a single tenant that has more users. So for example, I think it was mentioned yesterday at the keynote, SAP is one of our customers. They use Alfresco internally, and they run across, I think it's something like was mentioned, 50,000 users. And I don't know how many sites they use, but effectively all those dimensions have to scale up. And at Alfresco, that's something we're always working on a day-to-day basis in terms of scaling up all those parameters. So irrespective of whether it's number of tenants, it's probably just as interesting as the number of users and the number of overall, the size of usage across the board. And that applies to whether you're running in the cloud or Enterprise Edition.
In an environment where our company, for example, is the cloud for our customers, I'm curious about 3 different aspects, especially related to multi-tenancy. One is single sign-on from their environment, in which case our previous experience has been SAML, simple SAML, PHP environment is what we're doing with our older customers in different platform. How we might be able to support them in what they use currently.
Right.
We don't usually dictate that. They're doing it already.
I mean, the very quick answer, obviously I don't know the exact use case, but to put it another way, as soon as I get back from DevCon next week, I'm working on the SAML option for the cloud.
Okay, so that's just something that's coming.
It's coming, at least, definitely, definitely in terms of speculative futures, it's coming at least in the cloud instance, and obviously we'd have to discuss what that means in terms of the enterprise option. Well, there are single sign-on features in enterprise. If the way we do it in the cloud is a slight variation, then there's always the option to push that back into enterprise, but that hasn't been decided.
Okay.
But yes, so single sign-on in the past, and I think SAML and single sign-on is probably the example now, but in the past, a lot of people have asked about, for example, LDAP support, and that's something we haven't done yet, or probably is not in the immediate roadmap that I'm aware of, but one of the reasons is we've never had a solid use case as to how, for example, we would use LDAP. I mean, in some ways, it's very simple. If you had a single LDAP instance, you have all the users in that instance that cover your tenants across all your organizations. It works like it works now, but it's not something we've certified in terms of a QA setup, but also if you're using something like LDAP, it would be, you could partition it. You could have separate LDAP instances for customers. So that's something that's been talked about in the past and something we could, obviously, we would be interested in feedback for existing customers or prospects. But in terms of SAML and single sign-on, that's something we're working on now.
Okay. The second question then is regarding front end, maybe Drupal, maybe Joomla. How does that relate to a multi-tenant environment?
It comes back to really the basic premise that, at least from a multi-tenant core, for example, running enterprise or community, is driven by your login. So as long as you've got a fully qualified user ID, then all other lower level interfaces are driven by that. Okay. So for example, you're connecting from Drupal to Alfresco using CMIS, then as long as you have a unique login, and if you think about the cloud, that's how when you access the Alfresco in the cloud, it's the same. The only difference there is you can also then optionally switch, but normally by default you go in, your primary tenant is based on by definition, by your user ID. So yeah, so you should be able to, I mean, obviously, if you're running the example, we talked to a customer in Berlin. They've got their own custom interface. They're not using Drupal, but they have a completely custom user interface, and they're interested in using the multi-tenancy option. I think they're already using the multi-tenancy option. In fact, yes, they are. But what they do is when they host across those tenants, effectively those tenants get the same interface. So really the question then is there any customization required on a per tenant basis? And that's kind of outside of the scope of this talk, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so the application has to then be driven. If the application has to adjust, and that's why I touched on share, if the application has inbuilt features, for example, some kind of preferences mechanism for users, or that network admins can admins or network admins in terms of the cloud can set up predefined setup, in terms of customizing your dashboard or customizing the user interface. That should all be inbuilt. It's only when there's additional adaptations that need to be built, and that also has to become part of the application. And if it's Drupal, then that wouldn't be there unless you somehow managed what the tenants have chosen, which you could do with Alfresco because you could store it back. And one way of doing that is using the, I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but there's a thing called an attribute service, and there is ways of storing that in a system-wide basis. You could store attributes against each tenant. So if you, for example, if you wish to dynamically drive the UI through additional information that's stored in Alfresco, you could do that, but obviously that would have to be developed as a custom solution. But in terms of just standard access through things like CMIS, it would just work out of the box. But
yeah, we actually did do some testing with Drupal, and there was a single hard-coded connector account that I would use to get into the Alfresco. And it did work if I used an @tenant, for example, but it was a hard-coded
Yeah.
one account access into Alfresco as opposed to each person signing on.
Right.
How
I mean,
are
I'm
they
sure
connecting to
it,
Alfresco?
it depends how it depends if you're an enterprise customer, you could always discuss it with support to see if they could help. But obviously, if it's something custom, they'd want to know more about your setup. If your community, you can always raise it as a suggestion on Jira. But the thing with those things is, the more detail that's in there, the better, because
Right.
it would have to have a lot of detail about the use case, basically how you're testing it. If there was some bug that was exposed by the fact that you're using it in a certain way, theoretically we would just solve it. But the quickest way to do that is by having a very detailed test scenario.
The last real quick question.
But that's a way to provide feedback if you're in that situation.
Got it. The last one was regarding backup a multi-tenant environment. How do we do that effectively where it's restoring either to the same server or to a different server?
I mean, I can try and answer that now, or obviously you're quite interested in the subject, so we can meet later, because I think I've got engineering hours pretty much straight after this session. I think coming in about half an hour. So if you want to meet later, maybe that's easier. I don't know if there's any other. Sorry? Oh, you're interested. Okay. So you were asking about backup, were you? Yeah. Well, backup's always. I'm not a backup expert, so backup's always an interesting one. But in some ways, it depends what we mean by backup. But you'd have to back up your. In terms of what I've been talking about, you have to back up your whole Alfresco instance in a standard way. But obviously, there are other things around. Let's use the word export or migrating tenants, and that's something we will probably be looking at over a period of time, where I mentioned about, for example, routing tenant content. There may have to be options where we need to have to partition tenant data, which would imply that if there's an existing tenant that you may have to migrate out, which you can do through, there is an export mechanism that we provided from day one, but the export mechanism is based on what I talked about earlier in terms of those store structure, the node structure, which does export most of what you need, but it doesn't export everything. So for example, activity streams, or there's other examples. So it would have to be done in a dedicated way. So at the moment, if you wish to do that kind of thing, it would have to be done through partners or provide feedback to us. But an overall system backup would be the same as before. And in terms of things like content binaries, that's relatively straightforward if they're partitioned. So I think we've pretty much run out of time. But as I said, I'm actually going to be around all day. But also, I think I'm down for engineering hours. So if anybody's interested in coming to find me in the next half hour or so, please do. So thanks very much.